Welcome to Naresh Technologies. I'm Bangar Raju and this is the part 4 video of our constructors. So in the part 1, part 2, part 3 I was just demonstrating about what is a constructor, types of constructors and what is the use of constructors. And in this video I wanted to demonstrate about the difference between static constructors and non-static constructors. So just want to tell you about the difference between static constructors and non-static constructors. So in the types of constructors video, the part 2, I was explaining what is static constructor. What is a static constructor? If a constructor is explicitly declared by using a static modifier, we call that constructor as a static constructor. So if a constructor is explicitly declared by using a static modifier, we call that constructor as static constructor, whereas rest of other are non-static only. Rest of other are non-static constructors only. So if a constructor is explicitly declared by using a static modifier, we call that constructor a static constructor, whereas rest of other are non-static constructors only. So the point I am trying to tell you is, let me add a new class here. I will call it as constructors demo. Constructors demo. Now in this class I wanted to define two constructors. One is a static constructor and one is a non-static constructor. So static constructors demo, and remember this is a static constructor, and inside of it I am writing console.writeLine. Static constructor is called. Static constructor is called, and at the same time one more constructor, we'll name this as non-static constructor. Non-static constructors can also be called as instance constructors. We can also call them as instance constructors. Fine. Now this is a static constructor and this is a non-static constructor. So that's what I'm telling first point. If we declare it explicitly by using a static modifier, we call that constructor as a static constructor, whereas rest of other are non-static. So this is static and this is a non-static constructor. Okay. And remember, what is the need of a constructor? As per our discussion earlier, we have discussed it. What's it? Constructors are responsible for initializing the variables of a class or fields of a class. Constructors are responsible for initializing the fields or variables of a class. Okay? Are responsible for initializing fields or variables of a class. Fields or variables of a class. And now the very important point to remember, what you know, static fields are initialized by static constructors and non-static fields are initialized by non-static constructor. So this is the point to remember. Constructors are responsible for initializing fields of a class. So static fields are responsible for. So static fields are initialized by static constructors and non-static fields are initialized by non-static constructor. So what I mean to tell is, if at all I am going to declare a field here int x without a value and static int y without a value, both these two fields are going to have a default value. So both these two fields are going to have a default value. So default values are 0. And this is initialized by a non-static constructor and this is initialized by a static constructor. So like this, the first one is initialized by static constructor and the second one is initialized by non-static constructor. That's what. They're responsible for initializing fields or variables of a class. So static fields are initialized by static constructor and non-static fields are initialized by non-static constructor. So that is the second important point to remember about a constructor. Next, When will a static constructor execute? When will a non-static constructor execute? Static constructors are implicitly called. Static constructors are implicitly called, whereas non-static constructors must be explicitly called. Non-static constructors must be explicitly called. So, these constructors are implicitly called. Have a look. Static void main. Just defining a main because I need an entry point. Just I am only writing the code like console.readline just to make the screen to it. And now let me run this code. If you watch the output, static constructor is called. See, we don't have any code at all. See, even this readline also, let us just comment it. We have only main method, and this main method is entry point. Without that, we can never run a class. So, for that reason, I have written main method. But when I run this code, you notice it is going to call the static constructor. So, actually, we did not call the static constructor anywhere. It is not called anywhere. So, that's the point I am telling you. Static constructors are implicitly called, whereas non-static constructors must be explicitly called. We must explicitly call non-static constructors, but static constructors are never called explicitly, they are only called implicitly. Okay, fine. Next, the next point. Static constructor executes immediately once the execution of a class starts. Static constructor executes immediately once the execution of a class starts, and moreover, it's the first block of code to run under a class. Moreover, it is the first block of code to run under a class, whereas non-static constructors are called, or non-static constructors executes only after creating the instance of class as well as each and every time the instance of class is created. So, static constructors execute immediately once the execution of class starts. Just now I showed you. When I run this, you can see static constructor is called. So, immediately once the execution of a class starts, static constructor executes, and moreover, it is the first block of code to run under a class. It is the first block of code to run under a class. See, even if I am going to write some code in main method, I am going to write some code in the main method, console.writeLine, main method is called. I am just writing console.writeLine, main method is called. Run the code. Entry point is main method, and without that main method we can never run the code at all. That is entry point. But still you notice the code in the main method is not executing first, but the code in the static constructor is executing first. So when we see this, what we think a static constructor can start, static constructor is executing first. So you can make this an entry point. Never possible. Entry point is always main only. This is entry point. If I comment this one, if at all I am just going to comment this particular code here. If this code is commented, and if you try to run the application, it will give you an error. What is the error? There is no suitable. Constructor demo is my project name, is my class name, and this is my project name. Constructors demo does not have a suitable static main method. So there is no static suitable main method in the class, and without this you can never start a class at all. So execution starts with this only. No one can change that. No one can change that. But even though execution is going to start with this, okay, the first block to run under the class is always a static constructor. So execution starts here, and before it executes the code in the main, it jumps to the static constructor. And after jumping to the static constructor, executes the code in the static constructor and then comes back to the main method. You can just notice the output again. First what is called? Static constructor. Afterwards main method is called. So the point to note is static constructor executes immediately once the execution of a class starts, and moreover it is the first block of code to run under a class, whereas Non-static constructors execute only after creating the instance. And how many times I have executed the code till now? Till now, we did not see the message non-static constructor is called. The reason is non-static constructor is called only after creating the instance of class. Why? Because non-static constructors must be explicitly called, and we call a constructor while creating the instance. Okay, you can watch the part 1 video of the constructors. So there I was demonstrating. So no, we must explicitly call a constructor. So right now, what is our class name? Constructors demo D1 is equals to new constructor demo. And remember, this is a call we are making to the constructor. So if you put your mouse on this, it will show you. This is a class. This is a class present under demo project namespace. Class name is constructor demo. But here if you put a mouse, I am showing you constructor demo.constructor demo. What is it? Constructor demo.constructor demo? Constructor demo is the first thing what is showing is the class name, and the second one what is showing is the name of our constructor. So we must call a constructor explicitly. But which constructor? Non-static. Why? Static constructors are implicitly called. Run the code, you can see non-static constructor is called. So this is executing only after creating the instance of a class. So whereas non-static constructor executes only after creating the instance of a class, as well as each and every time the instance of class is created. What is the meaning of it? If I create one more instance to my class, one more time it is going to call the constructor. One more time. Another instance, again one more time. Like this, how many number of instances you go for creating for the class, that many number of times it is going to call the constructor. If you create 3 instances, it will call for 3 times. That's what. So as well as each and every time the instance of class is created. Now listen, in the life cycle of a class, life cycle in the sense, the moment we start the execution to end the execution can be considered as one life cycle. The moment you start the execution to end the execution is considered as one life cycle. In the life cycle of a class, static constructor executes one and only one time, whereas non-static constructor executes for 0 times if no instances are created and n times if n instances are created. So the minimum maximum number of times a static constructor executes in the life cycle is 1 and only 1. But when you come to non-static constructor, that will be 0, if no instances are created, and n if n instances are created. And if you remember the output, when I did not define these constructors, when I did not define any of these constructors, you can just notice it. It was not calling the constructor. So this proves 0 times. And now one instance created, one time called, but now also static constructor is called. 2 instances created, 2 times called, but now also static constructor is called one time only. And you created 3 instances and it is going to be called 3 times. But now also static constructor is called one and only one time. So this is the other difference what we just have between them. And if you want, you can just check now. Y and X are initialized. They are initialized. You can print their values also. Default values will be 0. Console.writeLine. You can directly print the Y value. Why? A static member of the class can be directly accessed in a static block. A static member of the class can be directly accessed in a static block. This is a static member and you can directly access it under a static block. So when you run this, it will print the value. It is printing the value, initialized. We did not give a value, but got initialized, and that responsibility is taken by the static constructor to initialize. Same way, console.writeLine. I cannot print X value like this. Why I cannot print? Non-static members of a class can never be directly accessed from a static block. They must be accessed only by using the class instance, because if you just understand, we created 3 instances and 3 instances will maintain 3 copies of X. Same value, but even though it is same value, tomorrow the values can be different, but today they are same value. But if you are trying to refer to the X here, the confusion starts here. What is the confusion? Which X are you referring? But don't I have 3 copies of Y? No. Y will be 1 and only 1 copy, but X is going to be 3 separate copies, because non-static field is going to be maintained separately for each instance, but static field is going to be 1 and only 1 copy for the whole class. So Y is single, directly you can call, but X is not single. So must say d1.x, printing the value, plus d2.x, printing the value, plus d3.x. You can just see 3 zeros, here 1 only. So actually zeros only now all, yeah, zeros only. We can give our own values, but right now what I am trying to tell you is, this field, even if not initialized, got a default value, and that initialization is done by the static constructor, and this field also has a default value, and that initialization is done by this constructor. So to prove that, I have printed the values to you. Okay, leave it. Next, the next difference. Non-static constructors can be parameterized. Non-static constructors can be parameterized, but static constructors cannot have any parameters. What is the meaning? Watch. This is a non-static constructor. I want to pass a parameter here. What is that? Int x. I want to pass a parameter. And if you are going to pass a parameter, and that value can be passed from here, see, 10, 20, 30. I am passing the value, and inside of my code I am writing this.x is equals to x. What is this.x? I am referring to this x, and x means it refers to the local variable x. And now you see d1.x, d2.x, d3.x has 3 separate values. This proves us, what is it? These are 3 separate copies. These are 3 separate copies. But if you just notice that I am able to pass parameters to my non-static constructor. Can we do the same thing with the static constructor? No, it is not possible. See, int y, and I want to assign this particular value y to this y. Okay, how to assign the value is secondary, but if you notice, I am getting an error there. I am getting an error. What is the error? A static constructor, you can read the second line. A static constructor must be parameterless. It must be parameterless. You cannot pass any parameters. But why? Why I cannot pass any parameters? Okay, can be parameterized, but static constructors cannot have any parameters, because static constructors are implicitly called. They are implicitly called. They are not explicitly called. They are implicitly called. When they are implicitly called, if they have any parameters, who will pass the value? If it is explicitly called, if there are having any parameters, I can pass the values. I can pass all the values as a developer. But implicitly called means values cannot be sent to it. So that is why that cannot be parameterized. And remember, and moreover, it's the first block of code to run under the class. It is the first block of code to run under the class. Because it is the first block of code to run under the class, from where can we send the value? If it is the second block of code to run the class, from the first block I can pass values to that. But that is only the first block. Because that is only the first block, there is no chance for passing the values for that. So these are the 2 reasons why they cannot be parameterized. Okay, next. Non-static constructors can be overloaded, whereas static constructors cannot be overloaded. What is the meaning? Non-static constructors can be overloaded. And just remember, overloading is something that comes into picture based on the parameters. Overloading is something that comes into picture based on the parameters. If at all we are going to have any parameters, based on that parameters, overloading will come into picture. So here I have a chance to pass parameters. I have a chance to pass parameters here. So because parameters can be passed here, overloading can be done. But here there are no parameters, no chance to pass parameters. So overloading is never allowed in case of the static constructors. Non-static constructors can be overloaded, whereas static constructors cannot be overloaded. Okay. And finally, the last point to understand here. What do you know? Every class contains an implicit constructor if not defined explicitly, and those implicit constructors are defined based on the following criteria. Every class contains an implicit constructor if not defined explicitly, and those implicit constructors are defined based on the following criteria. Okay, what are the criteria? Watch. Every class except a static class contains an implicit constructor. Every class except a static class contains an implicit non-static constructor. Contains an implicit non-static constructor if not defined with any explicit constructor. Every class except a static class. What is a static class? Static class means if a class is declared by using a static modifier, we call that class static class, and a static class can contain only static members in it. Can't have non-static members in it? No chance. It can contain only static members in it. Because it can contain only static members in it, you cannot have a non-static constructor in it also. So every class except a static class contains an implicit non-static constructor if not defined with an explicit constructor. Then what about static constructor? Static constructors are implicitly defined only if that class contains any static fields, or else that constructor will not be present. Static constructors are implicitly defined only if that class contains any static fields, or else that constructor will not be present at all. That constructor will not be present at all. Okay. If we define explicitly, if you define explicitly, that will be present. But here the discussion is not about explicit constructor. The discussion is all about implicit constructor. When will implicit constructor come into picture? In every class, you have a implicit non-static constructor except a static class. Whereas if you talk about a static constructors are not defined implicitly in every class. They are defined only if that class contains any static fields. No static fields, no static constructors also. So that is the other important point to remember about the constructors. So this is the differences. These are the differences between static and non-static constructors. So this is all about the constructors what we just have in a class. Thank you for watching the video. For more videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Naresh IT.